Hi, I hope you're well. We're going to try something new today, and that is true crime. With that in mind, things can get kind of gruesome with this kind of thing, so for warning, there's going to be some dead body talk. I'm going to try to be respectful, but it can still get pretty morbid, so you have been warned. Anyways, moving on. In the small town of Noble, Georgia, just at the northwest tip of the state and more than an hour away from Tennessee or Alabama, once held the Tri-State Crematorium. The facility was established in the 1970s and serviced all three states it was near to. At the time, it was congratulated. It gave people access to cremating their deceased loved ones' remains who would not have been able to do so before. It was operated for decades by a man by the name of Tommy Marsh. In the 90s, however, his health began to decline, and he left daily operations in the hands of his son, Brent Marsh. During Brent's time managing the crematory from 1996 to 2002, he took in and processed around 2,000 corpses, and on the surface, everything seemed to be running like a dream. Something would change in the 2000s, however, something that would leave the families of the deceased questioning if the urns they were given even held their loved ones inside, and it would leave the police to find the crematory property as a grisly scene that would later be compared to nothing short of a horror movie. Bodies meant to be cremated laid instead in plain sight all around the property. Hundreds of them were stuffed in vaults, a storage shed, and anywhere they could be fit around the crematorium. The nuclear fallout of this horrific scandal would reach nationwide coverage, and people would be left asking how and why this happened for decades to come. But to truly understand the depth of what happened here, we need to see things as they were 28 years ago. We're going back to 1996. Most of the problems were probably more deeply rooted and began before this year, but this is the year that Brent Marsh took over the crematory. His father, Tommy, was beginning to decline in health, so much so that he couldn't operate the place by himself anymore, so Brent had to take up the reins. He did so for years, in fact, and it wasn't really until October of 2002 that things started to seem not quite right here. There was a delivery man who came onto the property. He was delivering some propane tanks for the crematory, I believe, and he cited some weird things on the property. He went to the Walker County Sheriff's Department to report it, in fact. He could have sworn he saw human bodies on the property. Now, the Sheriff's Department, they didn't actually think much of it. Because it's a crematory, they're working with dead bodies, they thought, well, this is normal. We don't really need to investigate it, so nothing was done. It's over a year later, November 2001, when they get the next tip. This time it's the Environmental Protection Agency in Atlanta that gets it. Supposedly, someone sighted dead bodies in the woods near the crematory, but after this was relayed to the Walker County Sheriff's Department, they said they did a search, but they didn't find anything, so it was put off again. Now it's a few months later, February 14th, 2002. It's federal agents that get the tip this time. Someone had been walking their dog in the woods on the crematory property, and their dog found a strange bone. When they took it to the police, it was identified as human remains. This is where hell breaks loose. The next day, the property is officially marked as a crime scene. They bring in a federal disaster team to deal with the damage, and they ship in a portable morgue from Maryland. Throughout the next few days, they search the property and pick out 339 bodies and partial remains of people that were meant to be cremated. It's nothing short of pure distilled horror what they found, and they try to identify as many of the bodies as they can, but some of them are in such advanced stages of decomposition that they're just bones, and they don't know what family members to contact in order to identify them all. Out of all these bodies, 222 of them were identified, and that left 117 of them without names. Brent Marsh was taken into custody for this almost immediately, and the victims' families were contacted, only they were a little confused because a lot of them had already received urns supposedly filled with the ashes of their loved ones. They didn't understand how they could get a call about finding their loved ones' bodies on this man's property. As it turned out, a lot of people had received concrete dust in their urns, and some had received ashes, but they couldn't be traced back to the DNA of their loved ones. They were likely human remains that they received, but they had no way of telling of whether or not it was their loved ones that were in those urns. It was a man by the name of McCracken Poston who represented Brent Marsh. He was taken into custody, of course, but for about 3 years after the event, he was still being tossed around the legal system. In the end, though, he took a plea deal and served about 12 years in prison. He pled guilty to about 787 felony cases and served his time in the Central State Prison in Macon, Georgia. These charges ranged from everything they could get him for, from abuse of corpses to mishandling them to crematory-related fraud to emotional distress even for the victims. A lot of these families, they felt like they could never have the closure they needed. They would never know if the urns that had human remains but couldn't be traced back to anyone. They would never know if those actually held their family members. It was very upsetting. It was like a fresh wave of grief even after they'd already lost their loved ones. And they would never really get a solid reason as to why this happened. But now it's 2016. It's 20 years after Brent Marsh first started operating the crematory, and he's finally served his time, and he's going to be out on parole. A lot of the victims of these families say they were scared of the idea of having this man out in the public. They couldn't imagine sharing the space they did with someone who was capable of doing something like this. But Brent released an apology letter through his attorney. It was short, 1 page, and I'll have a link if you want to really read it in the description, but it was vague at best. He didn't address the specifics of what he did, and he didn't even say why he did it. He just said he was sincerely sorry for his actions, and he looked forward to being a part of the community again, doing some good. I can't imagine it provided a lot of closure for these families, because the why and how that this happened is very, very important when it comes to just processing it all, I think. There were a few legal loopholes that made this more likely to happen back then, though, I'd say. There was a Georgia-specific loophole for crematories at the time, that if they were dealing with licensed funeral homes, then the crematory itself wouldn't have to get a license to operate, and therefore they wouldn't have to go through any yearly state inspections. I believe that definitely contributed to what happened here, and it let things be put off even when things very clearly were not right at this crematorium. Brent himself, however, he never explicitly says why he let this happen, why he lied to these families, or why he set these corpses all around his property like a horror movie. They tested the crematory, its functioning. They said it functioned fine. All throughout his time operating the crematorium, he could have cremated these bodies. The only thing wrong with it was the ventilation system, and that's where another theory comes in. The leading theory is mercury poisoning, and this might seem like a bit of a stretch, but you're gonna have to hear me out on this one. Back in the 70s to the 90s, a popular filling for dental cavity amalgam was mercury. In the cremation process, it involves up to 2,000 degrees of heat, and that's enough to vaporize the soft tissues of a corpse. And while it may not always completely obliterate things like bones and teeth, it's more than enough to release some of that into the air as gas that can easily be breathed in. To support this theory, Brent Marsh was tested for mercury poisoning in his time in prison, and as it turns out, it was positive. His father, Tommy Marsh, passed away in 2003 of organ failure, and it's believed that Tommy also suffered from mercury poisoning. That's one of the symptoms of mercury poisoning, is your organs kind of giving out on you. So I think it's very possible. Just if you didn't know, by the way, an impaired cognitive function can easily mean an impaired life. I don't think it's impossible at all to pin mercury poisoning on this whole terrifying ordeal. Impaired cognitive function can impact your critical thinking skills, your memory, your ability to reason. It's not the horror story people make it out to be, but it's real. Many people, victims included, have attested that Brent's actions at this crematorium, they didn't seem malicious at all. And McCracken Poston, his attorney, he said that nothing untoward was done with the bodies. They were just moved around. I think it's it doesn't downplay how awful this shit is. It doesn't downplay the trauma that these victims went through, or the families. But I think it is worth considering that Brent Marsh was very likely experiencing a hell of his own inside his head at this time. Today, the building still stands. It's visible in maps, even though it's private property, and I'm not too sure who owns the building now. One thing is for sure, though, the crematory has been shut down long ago, and no one's ever going to be subjected to this amount of horror again. The legal loophole was patched. Brent Marsh is off doing some job that isn't cremating bodies, and the victims and their families, they can now have time to settle and find a way to find peace. That's all for me for today, though. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Bye.